In the spring of 1945, somewhere in Germany, an American pilot climbed into the cockpit of a Junkers Ju-87. He had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts for 2 years. He knew what a combat aircraft felt like: the power, the weight, the control response that a pilot internalizes until the machine is an extension of his body. He knew his own aircraft the way a craftsman knows his tools. He had never sat in a Stuka. What he found surprised him. Not the cramped space or the unfamiliar instruments. What surprised him was how purposeful the machine felt. How completely every design decision had been organized around a single function. He flew it. He put it into a dive. He didn't speak for an hour afterward. By 1944, the Ju-87 was 3 years past its moment of dominance. Made irrelevant by Allied fighter cover, by radar and anti-aircraft systems that had learned to find it in its dive, by the simple arithmetic of a 250-mile-per-hour aircraft in a sky where 400-mile-per-hour fighters were waiting. The Stuka was obsolete. But the American pilot who flew it wasn't silent for an hour because of its obsolescence. He was silent because of what it could do. In expert hands, the Ju-87 could deliver a bomb with an accuracy of less than 30 meters. Average pilots achieved a 25% hit rate, a number that sounds modest until you compare it to alternatives. Horizontal bombing against small targets, perhaps 1%. Fighter bombers in shallow dives, perhaps 5%. The Stuka, slow and vulnerable and obsolete, was hitting its targets 1 time in 4. No Allied aircraft in 1944 could match that. The P-47 was a magnificent machine. 8.50 caliber machine guns, a 2,000 horsepower engine, the ability to absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter and return to base. It could carry bombs. It bombed in shallow dives, because shallow dives were what a P-47 pilot was trained for. Shallow dives from a fast aircraft produce acceptable accuracy. Acceptable is not 30 meters. The Ju-87 had been designed in the 1930s by Hermann Pohlmann at Junkers to answer a specific question. How do you put a bomb exactly where you want it? The answer was dive bombing. Not shallow dives, 30 or 40 degrees. True dive bombing. 80 degrees from horizontal. The aircraft pointed almost straight at the ground, the target visible through the bomb sight, the pilot controlling the dive all the way to the release point. At 80 degrees, the bomb follows the aircraft's trajectory almost directly. The pilot aims the aircraft at the target. The bomb goes where the aircraft was pointing. What this required was a machine that could survive it. The forces in an 80-degree dive are enormous. Speed builds rapidly. Control surfaces become difficult to manage. The pullout produces G-forces that can render the pilot unconscious. Pohlmann's solution was the airframe itself. The Ju-87 was built for the dive the way a surgical instrument is built for the specific procedure it performs. Automatic dive brakes, panels extending from under both wings, limited speed so the aircraft would not tear itself apart. They also meant the pilot had time to aim. At terminal velocity in an unbraked dive, the target passed through the bomb sight in fractions of a second. With brakes deployed, the pilot could hold the target in the sight, make corrections, release the bomb with the precision of a marksman. A bomb cradle swung the weapon forward and down before release, ensuring it cleared the propeller arc. The aircraft was nose-heavy by design, so that in a steep dive it naturally tracked downward toward the target. And the automatic pullout. If the pilot lost consciousness from the G-forces, the aircraft would pull itself out. A mechanical system set at a fixed altitude that applied the elevator whether the pilot was conscious or not. The Ju-87 had been designed to make the impossible, putting a bomb through a specific window from an aircraft traveling 200 miles per hour, routine. The Stuka made its combat debut in 1936 over Spain. The German Condor Legion used it to test theories about close air support. that aircraft could function as flying artillery, striking specific targets on the battlefield in direct support of ground troops. The close coordination between tanks advancing on the ground and Stukas striking ahead of them, what would be formalized as the Blitzkrieg Doctrine, was practiced and refined in Spain before anyone else in the world understood what was being developed. Poland in September of 1939 was the first full demonstration. The Polish Air Force had fighters, entirely inadequate by 1939 standards. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters escorting the Stukas were 4 generations ahead of anything Poland could field. Without fighter opposition, the Stuka was what it had been designed to be. It destroyed bridges before Polish forces could use them for retreat. It found and attacked troop concentrations identified by tank commanders on the ground. It struck the specific targets that conventional artillery could not reliably hit. The Polish campaign ended in 5 weeks. France in May 1940 was the performance that made the Stuka a symbol. The French army was not Poland. It had tanks, aircraft, the Maginot Line, and the collective military memory of having stopped Germany in 1914. None of it addressed the specific vulnerability that Blitzkrieg had been designed to exploit. German armor went through the Ardennes, declared unsuitable for armored movement, and emerged behind the Allied lines. Stukas flew ahead of the panzers. When resistance appeared, the Stukas dealt with it. When French troops moved to block the advance, the Stukas found them on the roads. The Jericho trumpets, the wailing sirens heard before the aircraft was visible, had been designed to break the morale of troops with no effective answer to the aircraft above them. In France, most troops had no effective answer. The campaign lasted 6 weeks. In both Poland and France, the Stuka had done something unprecedented. It had functioned as direct support for ground forces with a precision that no weapon before it had achieved from the air. It had not bombed cities or supply depots. It had attacked a specific tactical targets, the bridge, the column, the artillery position, that were standing between the German army and its objective. An American officer studying the after-action analyses would have drawn an obvious conclusion. The Stuka was not just an aircraft, it was an argument that precision mattered more than power, that a bomb in the right place, from the right angle, at the right moment, was worth more than 10 bombs delivered approximately. The Americans were not drawing this conclusion, not because they were ignorant of the Stuka's effectiveness. The German campaigns had been analyzed in detail. The Americans were building a different argument. Speed matters more than precision. If your aircraft is fast enough to survive, if your pilots return and fly again tomorrow, if your production lines replace what you lose, then acceptable accuracy delivered in quantity by pilots who survive is more valuable than precise accuracy delivered by aircraft that do not. The P-47 was better at almost everything the Stuka did, except the one thing the Stuka had been built for: precision. The Battle of Britain was where the Stuka's assumption was tested and found wanting. The assumption was about the conditions required for it to operate. In Poland and France, those conditions existed. The Luftwaffe controlled the sky. The Bf-109 fighters were faster and better armed than anything opposing them. The Stuka could take its time over its target because nothing was coming to shoot it down. Britain was different. The RAF had Spitfires, Hurricanes, and radar, an early warning system the German intelligence assessments had systematically underestimated, and a decisive tactical advantage. The British fighters were flying over their own territory. A Bf-109 flying from France had fuel for perhaps 20 minutes of combat over the English coast. A Spitfire from a Kent airfield could fight until its fuel was gone. The mathematics of range and endurance were as decisive as speed and maneuverability. RAF pilots learned that the most effective time to attack a Stuka was not during the dive, but during the pull-out, the long, slow, curving climb back to altitude, when G-forces had the pilot momentarily incapacitated and the aircraft was at its most vulnerable. On August 18, 1940, the hardest day, Stuka units lost 17 aircraft in a single afternoon. In the 10 days between August 8th and 18th, nearly 20% of the entire Stuka force committed to the Battle of Britain had been destroyed. Goering withdrew the Stukas. The decision was correct and obviously necessary. It demonstrated something about the Stuka its designers had built in and hoped to work around. The Ju-87 was not a universal weapon. It was a specific weapon, optimized for a specific set of conditions: close air support in an environment where friendly fighters controlled the sky. When those conditions existed, it was extraordinarily effective. When they did not, it was extraordinarily vulnerable. This is the key fact the American pilot would have understood immediately. The aircraft was not obsolete because it had been superseded by better technology. It was obsolete because the conditions it required had ceased to exist. After 1941, the Luftwaffe rarely controlled the sky over any battlefield long enough for the Stuka to operate safely. This distinction matters enormously and is almost always missed. A weapon obsolete because better technology superseded it is obsolete permanently. The better technology keeps improving. The gap widens. The old weapon has no future. A weapon obsolete because the conditions it requires no longer exist is a different case. The weapon itself remains effective. The question is not whether it works. The Stuka always worked. The accuracy numbers never changed, but whether it can survive long enough to demonstrate that effectiveness. The answer after 1941 was usually no, except when Rudel was flying it. Hans-Ulrich Rudel had not volunteered for Stuka training by choice. He had volunteered for dive bombing in 1938 because the alternative was heavy bombers, and heavy bombers seemed worse. By the time he understood what he had volunteered for, it was too late to change his mind. Then he flew the aircraft. Something happened to Rudel in the cockpit of a Ju-87 that military history has difficulty categorizing. He did not simply learn to fly it, he became it. The aircraft and the pilot formed a combination that operated at a level of effectiveness that no one, not the Luftwaffe commanders, not the Soviet forces who tried to kill him, not the historians who have studied his records for 80 years, has been able to fully explain. His first operational mission was in June 1941. On his very first day flying the Ju-87G anti-tank variant, he disabled 4 tanks. By the end of the day, 12, the equivalent of an entire armored company, in a single afternoon, by a pilot on his first day with the new aircraft. The Stuka had found its Rudel, or Rudel had found his Stuka. The distinction matters less than the result. A man and a machine designed for the same purpose, operating together with an efficiency that made the theoretical precision of the Ju-87 concrete, measurable, and impossible to dismiss. Hans-Ulrich Rudel's record is one of the most extraordinary in the history of aerial warfare. It is also one of the most uncomfortable, because Rudel was an unrepentant Nazi who spent the post-war decades defending Hitler, helping war criminals escape justice, and writing memoirs that glorified the ideology he had served. He sheltered Joseph Mengele in South America. He was, politically and morally, indefensible. He was also the most effective ground attack pilot in the history of the war. 2,530 combat missions, a record that stands to this day. 519 tanks destroyed. The Soviet battleship Marat sunk at Kronstadt on September 23, 1941, with a single 1,000-kilogram bomb delivered in the dive that only Rudel flew. 2 cruisers, 70 landing craft, 150 artillery pieces. Stalin put a 100,000 ruble bounty on his head. He was shot down 30 times. Each time he survived, returned, and flew again. He lost a leg in February 1945 when his aircraft was hit and he crash-landed in Soviet territory. He escaped on foot. He received a prosthetic leg and returned to combat. He flew his last combat mission on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The Luftwaffe had long since lost air superiority over the Eastern Front. Soviet fighters, eventually formidable, were hunting Stuka formations with increasing effectiveness. The conditions the Ju-87 required had ceased to exist. Rudel flew anyway. Not because he was ignorant of the risk. He was shot down 30 times. He flew because his specific combination of skill, aggression, and tactical innovation had compressed the window of vulnerability to a margin he believed he could survive. The specific innovation: attack from behind. The Soviet T-34 had its thickest armor on the front and sides. The rear, where the engine was thinner, vulnerable to the 37mm cannon the Ju-87G carried. Attacking from behind meant flying in the direction of German lines. If hit, a chance of crash landing on your own side. If the maneuver worked, the tank burned. On his best day, Rudel destroyed 12 tanks. That was his first day with the aircraft. His record in single days reached higher. By the end of the war, Rudel had flown more combat missions than any pilot in history, destroyed more armor than any pilot in history, and survived wounds, including amputation of a leg, that ended careers and lives. The Luftwaffe tried to ground him repeatedly. Hitler ordered him to stop flying. Rudel ignored the orders. The Knight's Cross was awarded to 7,321 German servicemen. Rudel received something created specifically for him, the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. Hitler had the medal designed because the existing decorations were insufficient for what Rudel had done. The accuracy that the American pilot would feel in 1945 was the same accuracy Rudel had been weaponizing for 4 years. Rudel had refined it further through 2,530 repetitions of learning exactly how much control input was exactly right. RAF pilot reviews noted the aircraft handled so light that there was a marked tendency to overcontrol. Too much input, and the aircraft wandered off the aim point. The right amount, specific, practiced, internalized, and it essentially aimed itself. He had been bombing for years with a machine that was excellent at many things. He had just flown a machine that was perfect at one. The silence afterward was not incomprehension. It was the specific silence of a craftsman who has just used a tool better than any he has known, and is thinking about what that means for everything he thought he understood about his work. The American pilot who flew the Stuka in 1945 had a specific frame of reference for what he experienced. He was not a test pilot or engineer. He was a combat pilot who had spent years finding targets, attacking them, and returning to do it again. He had dropped bombs from a P-47 in shallow dives over France and Germany. He had made bombing runs on bridges, rail yards, columns of German vehicles, fortified positions. He knew, with the knowledge of a man who had done it hundreds of times, how accurate he was. The honest answer? Approximately accurate. Good enough. Miss the bridge by 30 meters, and the bridge is intact. Miss by 3 meters, and the bridge might still be intact. Hit the bridge, and the bridge is down. P-47 pilots hitting bridges made multiple passes, multiple bombs, multiple pilots. The bridge came down when enough ordnance was applied. The doctrine had absorbed the imprecision and compensated with volume. The Stuka's doctrine was different. One pass, one bomb, one bridge. Not because Stuka pilots were braver or more skilled, because the aircraft was designed to make one pass sufficient. The 80-degree dive, the automatic brakes, the nose-heavy tracking, engineering solutions to the problem of imprecision. The aircraft compensated for what the pilot could not do perfectly by building the compensation into the machine. When the American pilot put the Stuka into its dive for the first time, several things happened that he had never experienced in a P-47. The aircraft committed. In a P-47 bombing run, the pilot was always negotiating with the machine, adjusting angle, correcting for wind, the dozens of small inputs that kept the aircraft on the approach to the target. In the Stuka's dive, the negotiation ended. The aircraft went where it was pointed, tracked the target with a solidity the pilot could feel through the controls, held the line through the brake-controlled deceleration that gave him seconds, actual seconds, to aim. RAF pilot reviews noted the aircraft handled so light that there was a marked tendency to over-control. The nose-heavy design that made the aircraft slightly awkward in level flight became, in the dive, exactly what the task required. The American pilot had spent years fighting his aircraft's natural tendencies. The Stuka's natural tendencies were toward the target. He released the bomb at what felt, for the first time in years of bombing, like exactly the right moment. Not calculated. A felt moment. The machine and the target and the pilot aligned in a way that produced certainty rather than calculation. The bomb went where he aimed it. He pulled out, automatic brakes cushioning the G-forces, the aircraft leveling itself, and climbed back to altitude. He looked at where the bomb had landed. He didn't speak for an hour. Not because he was in shock, because he was thinking about what he had just understood. He had dropped hundreds of bombs, done the job with the tools he had. He had just discovered that a different set of tools would have done the job differently. Not better in every way. The Stuka was slower, more vulnerable, dependent on conditions that no longer existed. He would not trade his P-47 for it. Not in 1945, not in airspace over Germany, where fighters were still contesting the sky. But for the specific task of putting a bomb on a specific target from the air, the Stuka had answered the question more completely than anything he had flown. The question was precision. The answer had been sitting in a captured airfield since 1941. The Americans had made the correct assessment. Too slow, too vulnerable for contested airspace. The doctrine of volume over precision had been right for the war they were fighting. But the pilot in 1945 was not thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about what he had just felt. The question the Stuka answered, how do you put a bomb exactly where you want it, was still unanswered in the American inventory. It would stay unanswered for 20 years. The American doctrine of volume over precision was not wrong. It was correct for the conditions in which it was applied. The conditions: air superiority, industrial production capacity sufficient to replace losses, and a strategic objective that required the systematic destruction of infrastructure, rail lines, bridges, fuel depots, production facilities. Against that objective, volume worked. 800 B-17 dropping 10,000 bombs on a rail marshalling yard would eventually destroy enough of the network to impede German logistics. The approach required more aircraft, more bombs, more fuel, and America had all of those things in quantities Germany could not match. The Stuka's precision was optimized for a different strategic objective. In Poland and France, the German objective was the destruction of specific defensive positions at specific moments. A bridge needed to be destroyed now, before the retreating enemy could use it. An artillery battery needed to be neutralized precisely, because the panzers behind the Stukas would be in range within the hour. This was the doctrine the Stuka had been built for: true close air support. The specific target, at the specific moment, identified by the specific tank commander who needs it destroyed in the next 10 minutes. The American approach was effective and sophisticated. Forward air controllers, communication between ground forces and fighter-bomber pilots, cab-rank patrols that kept P-47s orbiting available targets. Better than the German system at the operational and organizational level. It was worse at the terminal level. The moment when the bomb left the aircraft and either hit the target or didn't. The P-47 pilot making a close air support run in Normandy had targets identified by ground forces, some fighter cover, and needed to put bombs on specific positions. His bomb hit rates were better than horizontal bombing. They were worse than dive bombing, not because he lacked skill, because his aircraft, optimized for contested airspace, had traded the extreme dive angles that produced precision for shallower angles that allowed a fast aircraft to survive. The trade was correct for the environment. The American pilot who flew the Stuka in 1945 had reached the correct conclusion. The Stuka's precision was not worth the cost in vulnerability. The American approach was right, and yet, the specific sensation in the cockpit, the feeling of the aircraft committing to the target, the seconds of genuine aim time, the moment of release that felt like certainty, was something he had not experienced in 2 years of combat flying. It nagged. Not because it suggested the Americans had been wrong, because it suggested that the question the Stuka had answered, precision delivery of ordnance against a specific point target, was a question the American answer had not fully addressed. The American answer was, enough bombs will eventually destroy the target. The Stuka's answer was, one bomb, placed correctly, destroys the target. Both answers won the same war. The question was, which answer you wanted for the next one. In Korea in 1950, American pilots flying close air support found the bomb hit rates approximately the same as they had been in 1944 and 1945. Approximately accurate, good enough, compensated by volume. The nagging question had not been answered. It had been deferred. It would not be fully answered until 1972, when laser guidance systems allowed American pilots to place bombs not approximately, but precisely, within meters, then feet, and the doctrine the Stuka had embodied in 1939 was finally achievable with aircraft that could survive to implement it. The silence after the flight was not just about bombing accuracy. The American pilot had flown an aircraft designed with a philosophy different from anything in his own Air Force's inventory, a different philosophy about what an aircraft is for. The P-47 was designed to do many things well. Fighter capable of defeating Luftwaffe aircraft in certain conditions. Bomber capable of delivering ordnance. Ground attack aircraft capable of suppressing enemy positions. Survivable enough to absorb damage and return to base. Versatile enough that the same airframe could perform different missions on different days. This versatility was deliberate, the product of an Air Force doctrine that valued flexibility over specialization. The same aircraft in the same units performing multiple roles. Across the full range of operational requirements, flexibility would produce better results than specialized aircraft. The doctrine was correct at the strategic and operational level. The evidence is the outcome of the war. But it had a cost at the tactical level. Versatile aircraft are compromises. The P-47 was fast because it had an enormous engine, but that engine made it heavy, which affected maneuverability. It was survivable because it was built ruggedly, but ruggedness added weight. It attacked from shallower angles than a dedicated dive bomber because shallow angles are survivable, and doctrine prioritized survival over precision. Each of these trade-offs was correct. The Stuka's trade-offs went the other direction. Slow, because speed at the target was less important than stability in the dive. Vulnerable, because the design prioritized the task over survival. The fixed undercarriage added drag, but had been retained because it simplified maintenance in the rough forward airfields that close air support required. Everything about the Stuka had been optimized for the task. The American pilot had spent 2 years flying an aircraft optimized for the environment. He had just flown an aircraft optimized for the task. The experience had made him understand, for the first time, the distinction between the two. An aircraft optimized for the environment can survive, fly multiple missions, return home, be repaired, and flown again. More valuable in the calculus of sustainability than an aircraft that performs one task perfectly and cannot survive the environment in which it performs it. The Americans had been right about this. The P-47 pilot who flew 50 missions and returned from all of them had delivered more ordnance, killed more Germans, destroyed more infrastructure than the Stuka pilot who flew 3 missions and was shot down on the 4th. But the American pilot who flew the Stuka was not thinking about the 50 missions. He was thinking about the moment of release. Rudel had thought about nothing but the moment of release for 2,530 missions. He had refined it through years of tactical innovation and extraordinary individual skill until the moment of release was no longer a calculation, but a reflex. Until the aircraft and the pilot were so completely aligned in their shared purpose that the distinction between them became almost meaningless. The Stuka was not a better aircraft than the P-47. It was a better tool for one specific task. And the task, putting a bomb exactly where you wanted it, was the one task that all the missions, all the ordnance, all the training had been aimed at. In that specific task, the Stuka was the most effective aircraft he had ever flown. The P-47 would win every dogfight. The P-47 would survive every mission. The P-47 would drop more total ordnance on more total targets across a longer campaign. The Stuka would put the bomb through the window. That was what the silence was about. Not admiration for the enemy. The silence of a craftsman who had discovered a tool he did not know existed, doing something he had been trying to do for years, doing it better than he had ever done it, and understanding simultaneously Why the tool could not survive. The conditions it required had been real for 2 years, 1939 to 1941, when the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. The conditions had changed. The tool had not. Rudel had compensated through skill so extraordinary that it ceased to be a reasonable model for anyone else. He survived because he was Rudel. Without him, the aircraft should have been retired in 1941. But the question it answered was real and unanswered. The question of precision haunted air power doctrine for the 25 years after the Second World War. Not explicitly, the doctrine was written in terms of strategic objectives, force composition, sortie rates, and bomb damage assessment statistics. The question of whether a bomb hit its target or landed 50 meters away was addressed in terms of circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of bombs would fall, and that figure was used to calculate how many bombs would achieve a given level of target destruction. This was honest mathematics. In strategic bombing, where the target was a city's industrial capacity or rail infrastructure, circular error probable of several hundred meters was militarily acceptable. Enough bombs within several hundred meters of a factory would destroy the factory. In close air support, circular error probable of several hundred meters was not acceptable. The tank was 30 meters from your own infantry. The artillery position was adjacent to a village. The error acceptable in strategic bombing was catastrophic in close air support. Vietnam brought this problem into focus in a way that the Second World War had not. In the Second World War, close air support had been conducted largely in open terrain where targets were visually identifiable and militarily separated from civilian concentrations. The problems of precision were real, but bounded. In Vietnam, the terrain was jungle. The enemy was often invisible. The separation between military and civilian concentrations was frequently impossible to determine from altitude. The civilian casualties produced by bombs that fell 50 meters from intended targets, acceptable in the mathematics of circular error probable, were not acceptable in the political calculus of a war being fought in front of television cameras. The problem was not pilot skill. No aircraft in the American inventory, however capable, could reliably put an unguided bomb within 10 meters of a specific point target. The Stuka could, with average pilots, in 1939. The solution arrived not from aircraft design but from guidance systems. Laser-guided bombs, developed in the late 1960s and first used operationally in Vietnam in 1972, allowed a bomb to home on a laser spot. The bomb would fall toward the laser, correcting its trajectory through control fins, and strike within meters of the designated point. The circular error probable of a laser-guided bomb was less than 10 meters, sometimes less than 3. An F-4 Phantom dropping a laser-guided bomb could put it through a specific window. In 1972. In 1939, the Stuka could put it through a specific window with a trained pilot and the engineering of dive brakes and automatic pullouts that Hermann Pohlmann had designed into the airframe. The question the Stuka had answered required 33 years and precision guidance technology for the American Air Force to answer in a way that did not require the aircraft to survive the dive. The American pilot who flew the Stuka in 1945 had sat in silence for an hour because he had understood, without being able to articulate it fully, that the question he had just experienced being answered was a question that was going to matter. He was right. It mattered in Korea, where close air support against armor required the same precision the Stuka had offered, and American aircraft achieved it approximately. It mattered in Vietnam, where the political cost of imprecision became the political cost of the war. It matters today, when precision is measured not in circular error probable, but in the specific confidence that a weapon will strike a specific target and not the building next to it. The doctrine of precision, one bomb, one target, placed correctly, is the dominant doctrine of contemporary air power. Every smart bomb, every laser-guided weapon, every GPS-guided munition is an answer to the question that Hermann Pohlmann tried to answer in 1935 with dive brakes and automatic pullouts and a nose-heavy airframe. Pohlmann's answer required the aircraft to nearly point itself at the ground. The modern answer lets the bomb find its own way. The question is the same. The Stuka was the first serious answer to it. It was obsolete by the time the American pilot flew it. The question was not. Hans-Ulrich Rudel surrendered to American forces on May 8, 1945. He was 32 years old. He had flown more combat missions than any pilot in history, destroyed more armor than any pilot in history, survived wounds that had killed other men, received a medal created specifically for him because no existing decoration was sufficient. He had flown his last combat mission that morning on a prosthetic leg in an aircraft obsolete for 4 years. He would live until 1982. He spent those 37 years being exactly the kind of post-war figure that made the Allies deeply uncomfortable. An unrepentant Nazi who used his wartime reputation to give credibility to the politics he had served. He helped war criminals escape. He sheltered Mengele. He was the most decorated German serviceman of the war and a genuinely reprehensible human being. These two facts existed simultaneously and did not cancel each other out. The American pilots who evaluated the Ju-87 in 1945 filed detailed technical reports. The reports noted the aircraft's vulnerabilities accurately. They noted the flying qualities that surprised them: the lightness of controls, the nose-heavy tracking in the dive, the specific sensation of an aircraft designed to go downward toward a target. The reports did not note the hour of silence. That is not what technical reports record. But the pilots had experienced what the silence was about. Flying a machine built with a different set of priorities, a machine that had decided at the design stage that the task mattered more than the survival of the aircraft performing it. This was not a philosophy the American Air Force had adopted. Volume over precision, survivability over specialization. These were the right answers for the war America had fought. But the pilots who flew the Stuka in 1945 had understood something about the question that Pullman had been trying to answer in 1935. The question was about what you were willing to accept as close enough. In strategic bombing, close enough meant the factory was rubble. In close air support, the Stuka's mission, close enough meant the tank was burning. The tank was 30 meters from your own troops. The bomb had to hit the tank, not approximately, the tank. Every Air Force in every war since 1945 has returned to this problem: what to do when the target is specific, small, and adjacent to things you cannot afford to hit. The Stuka solved it by making the aircraft a precision instrument. The modern solution, laser guidance, GPS, solves it by making the bomb a precision instrument. The difference is that the modern solution does not require the aircraft to dive to 800 feet over a defended target. The Stuka's solution required exactly that, and there was one pilot who could do it 2,530 times and survive. One. The American pilot who flew the Stuka understood this too, during his hour of silence. The machine was extraordinary. The conditions it required had been exceptional. The pilot who had kept it operational after those conditions ceased to exist had been unique. You cannot build a doctrine around Rudel. You can build a doctrine around laser guidance. The Stuka's answer had been correct. The mechanism, a specific aircraft, a specific pilot, a specific set of conditions that no longer existed, had been unrepeatable. That was why it was obsolete. The question it had answered was not obsolete. The question it had answered was what the next 50 years of air power development would be organized around answering in a way that didn't require the pilot to be Rudel. Rudel himself, in his post-war memoir, described flying the Ju-87 as a calling rather than a profession. He wrote about the relationship between the pilot and the aircraft with the language of someone describing a vocation, a specific, personal, unrepeatable alignment between a man and a machine that had produced something neither could have achieved separately. He was right about that, whatever else he was wrong about. The American pilot who flew the Stuka went back to his P-47. He did not switch aircraft. He did not write a report arguing that the American Air Force had been wrong. He flew the rest of his missions in the aircraft he had been trained on. the aircraft that the conditions of 1945 required, the aircraft that could survive. But something had changed in his understanding of what he was doing. Before the Stuka, bombing was a task he performed approximately. He aimed as well as he could, released at the calculated moment, assessed the results, planned the next pass if the target was not destroyed. After the Stuka, he understood bombing as a task with a different standard. Not approximately, precisely. The standard the Stuka had demonstrated was theoretically achievable. He had achieved it himself, in one flight, in an aircraft he had never sat in before. But the standard required a different aircraft, or different conditions, or both. Neither was available in 1945. But the standard existed. This is the thing that the hour of silence was about, at its deepest level. Not the shock of a revelation, the specific, quiet recognition of a craftsman who has just understood that the standard he has been working to is not the highest standard that exists. That a higher standard is achievable. That the tools to achieve it have not yet been invented, or not yet survived long enough to be useful, but that the standard itself is real. The pilot who has experienced precision once in a captured aircraft in a spring afternoon in Germany in 1945 carries that standard with him. He knows it is possible because he has felt it. He goes back to his P-47 and flies approximately. But he knows. The Ju-87 Stuka made its first flight in 1935. Its last combat mission was flown on May 8, 1945. In the 10 years between those dates, it had been built in approximately 6,000 copies and employed in every theater of the Second World War. Decisive in 3 campaigns. Increasingly irrelevant in every campaign after 1941. Its legacy is not the campaigns where it was decisive. Its legacy is the question it answered. Every precision-guided munition fired since 1972. Every laser-guided bomb dropped in the Gulf War, in Kosovo, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Every GPS-guided bomb described, in the language of modern warfare, as surgical. The surgery the Stuka performed in 1939 required the aircraft to be the instrument. The surgery performed today uses the weapon as the instrument and lets the aircraft stay at altitude. The goal is the same, the bomb in the window. Rudel flew 2,530 missions to demonstrate that the goal was achievable. That a pilot in the right aircraft could put a bomb in a specific place with a precision that changed what air power meant on a battlefield. He was demonstrating a principle. The principle survived him. The aircraft did not. The 2 surviving Ju-87s are in museums. Neither is airworthy. The aircraft that demonstrated that precision was achievable is preserved behind glass. Some visitors know the other story. The story of an American pilot who climbed into the cockpit in the spring of 1945 and didn't speak for an hour. He had flown hundreds of missions. He had dropped hundreds of bombs. He was good at his job. He had just understood that the job had a higher standard than he had known. He had spent 3 years dropping bombs from an aircraft built to go fast and survive. He had just flown an aircraft built for one thing only: to put the bomb exactly where you aimed it. The Stuka was obsolete. The question it had answered was not. The question is still being answered, one precise weapon at a time. Herman Pullman asked it in 1935, with dive brakes and a nose-heavy airframe. Hans-Ulrich Rudel answered it 2,530 times, with skill that cannot be trained. The American pilot understood it on a spring afternoon in Germany, in a cockpit that smelled of foreign oil, pointing a dead empire's aircraft at the ground.